So we looked at the annotations that we use in controllers, and now we're going to take a look at the model related data annotations. And these are the annotations that you have been using so far. And the ones that we have been using require a using statement that pulls in system component model data annotations. And so I've got, some of these here. This is going to affect the accuracy of the data. And then there are also model related annotations that will actually affect the table that is created when you do code first. You can change the name of the table. You can change, normally it takes your property name and makes that the column name. But if you want the column name to be different, you can specify that. You can specify if you want a property to become an index, or you can specify a foreign key if you are not going to follow code first conventions. So we're going to take a look at these, and there are plenty of examples for you to view as well. So in general, you do not need to specify key unless you are not following code first conventions. If you use ID, or if you use the class name followed by ID, then code first is going to make that the primary key. In this example, the name of the class is members. And instead of having members ID, I am naming the property membership. Okay, so in this case, I do need the key attribute. Now, I do have a side note here that if you are creating a composite key, which is a multi-value key, then you're going to actually have to change your context file because you cannot do that in the class itself. So here's an example of a context file. And here's an example down here of how you would create your composite key. So you have to tell it the table, and then you use .hasKey, and you're going to say new, and then you're going to give it the two properties that are going to make up your key. Concurrency check. So you saw how that is handled in the controller. And a concurrency check basically is going to check to see if the data has changed since you retrieved it. So this kind of situation is user one is editing let's say author 10, okay? And user two is trying to edit author 10. This would, if you are afraid that this type of situation can occur, then you're going to want to put in a concurrency check. And you can flag multiple properties here for checking. There is another way for you to kind of tell if a row has been changed. And again, the reason that you want to do this is because if user one grabbed author 10's data and user two grabbed author 10's, okay, if user two makes changes and saves it, user one no longer has accurate data. And we don't want user one to be able to save changes because it's going to negate what user two did. Okay, so then we're out of sync. So that's why you do concurrency checking. So here we've added a couple of the properties that we want to check. Probably more importantly, we would want to insert a timestamp. And the timestamp can only be applied to a byte data type. And we call the property row version. Okay, and we add a timestamp to that. So what happens with this is, in the case of the author ID example, user 1 grabs author 10, user 2 grabs author 10. Each one has a timestamp, okay? And at this point, the timestamp is the same, okay? But then user 2 makes an update and saves it. So the timestamp changes. So now user 1 is out of sync, and we can tell immediately by checking the timestamp. Okay, so that is why it's used. And if the timestamps are out of sync, then it's going to flag an error. Required. So this would be on any property that you would like to display as not null in your database. Required means not null. You don't really need it on the primary key because that is going to be required, okay? But on anything else, any other property that you want to display as not null in your database table, you need required. Max length is the maximum size for a string or an array. Okay, and so in this little example, you can see that for title, which is my property, I have it required. I'm going to have concurrency check on it, and I got a max length of 24. Okay, so if the title is longer than 24 characters, it's not going to let it type that in. Okay, and so code first will take all of this, and it's going to create the end varchar column, size 24. It's going to say not null. Okay, and so here's an example of a form where we are actually entering in data. And so as I enter data and I get more than 24 characters, here's the little error message that displays. Minimum length. So this is the smallest size that a string or array can be. Okay, so you can have a maximum and a minimum size. And then if they try to key in anything that's less than the minimum, it is going to display an error. So again, that was min length and max length. We also have string length. This lets you give it a minimum and a maximum. Okay, so if we have string length, we can give it a value for the maximum, and then we can say minimum length equals and give it a value. So this does the same thing as the previous two commands, but it just does it in one data annotation. So just a side note though, it is not going to use minimum length when the table is created. It only uses max length. So the minimum length is for data validation only. A range. So this is for a numeric field where you can give it a minimum and a maximum. Display. So if you specify a string as the display, that is what it uses in all the forms. Okay, it's still going to use your property name when it generates the table, but in all the forms that display, it is going to use that display name. So the attribute is called display. And then in parentheses, you have name equal, and then you tell it what you want for the display name. Okay, so this does not change the actual column name in the table, only what you see in your views. There's a separate attribute that will change what's in the table, and that's the column attribute. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. Data type and display format. These are kind of useful for dates, and I think I've seen dates and email in them. There's different data types that these can be used for. It doesn't really help with validation, but it is useful for formatting. So we've got date, time, currency, money, and email. So we've got data type, and then we do data type dot date. Okay, so that it knows we're dealing with a date, and then you can give it a display format for the date. Okay, and here enrollment date is the property. And chances are, if you're going to use this, you're probably going to have to look up the display formats. This is probably not something that you are going to remember off the top of your head. This next example, this is also a pretty common one. The display format, if there's an empty string, it says convert empty string to null, true. But as far as the null display text goes, I chose to display nothing. Okay, and we're using, this is the extra description property that we're looking at. Here's posted date. And you can see we have a display format for that as well. If you Google, if you actually Google display format in brackets, or data type in brackets, you should be able to pull up pages. This is from Microsoft Learn, and you can see here's another convert empty string to null, but the display text is null in brackets. Here's a display format, data format string. This would be for a currency format. Okay, and then here is apply format and edit mode is true, and the format string is for a date. Okay, so there's all sorts of different format strings. So you just need to kind of look up, what that attribute is. For password, you can see that I've got data type dot password, and that ensures that I'll get the dots there instead of actually seeing it. So what we've looked at so far are attributes that are primarily for validation. They don't really affect how the table is created. This next attribute does affect the table. You can actually change the name of the table and specify a schema. And so if you're going to use anything that modifies the table itself, then your using statement needs to be system component model data annotations dot schema. And so in this little example, normally it would create a table called student. But you can see I am controlling what that name is going to be. And this is going to override your context. So in your context file, you also are specifying on your DB set statement the name of your table, but it's actually going to use this instead. And so here I have specified a table name, and I've also specified a schema. And so most schemas are database objects. So the table name is prefixed in the database with the schema. And so it's prefixed with DBO, database object. People will create schemas to group different tables together. And you can also use schemas to add security. So you can apply different permissions to users, at the database level, at the table level, or at the schema level. And so that's primarily how schemas are used. So here, our little example, our table is going to be named student info. It's going to have the schema undergrad instead of DBO. And then you can see that we did specify a key just because our table name is going to be a little different. We have a concurrency check on last name. It's required, and we put a limit to the length. We also have a concurrency check on their first and middle names. And we also specified a length for that as well. Column name, this lets you change the actual name of the column in the table. Normally, the column is going to take on the property name. So if I have a last name like this, then that's what is going to be in the database. But if I wanted the column name to be different, I can specify that. Okay. And so then when you do your migrations and you actually look at the table, okay, in this case, we're basically overriding the table name, and we are overriding several of the column names. When you look at that database, you will see that the table name and the column names are indeed overridden. Foreign key. So the convention for a foreign key is that it is either going to look for this statement where you're pulling in the class, and it'll generate a foreign key for you, or you can actually pull in the foreign key and the class. But if you change the name of the foreign key, or you want the foreign key to have a different name, then you would use the foreign key attribute. So in our standard class, the primary key is standard ID. Okay. And so if I am pulling in something else, I want to specify that that is the foreign key. Not mapped. So if there's data that you have in your class that it's temporary, it's something that you don't really want to store in the database for whatever reason, then you can indicate that it is not mapped. And when we do migrations and we create the database, it will not add that property as a column. And so in this little example, we got a lot going on because we're changing the name of the table, and we're changing the names of a bunch of the columns. But then we get down here to the mother's name and the father's name. And so you can see that those are not mapped. So that might just be for something that we're doing with our app, but it's not data that we want actually saved and stored. Okay, so we're indicating that we're not going to put that in the database. All of your error messages can be customized. And so basically whatever your data annotation attribute is. If you do not like the error message that displays by default, in parentheses, you can display your own. Okay, and so you can see several examples of that.